Tom and Sadie on 103.7 WTIB and 94.1 WNBU.
Welcome back in. 22 minutes past 5. Tom and Sadie with you for Thursday's Ride Home. A little political trivia Thursday. Got a special guest with us this afternoon, Taylor Griffin. Taylor is challenging incumbent Walter Jones in the Republican primary for the North Carolina Congressional District 3. Taylor, welcome to News and Views.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
You were on with us once before when you first announced, which was, back in a long time ago?
October the 4th.
Okay, you remember it well.
2013.
All right.
Do. Right here, sitting in this same seat.
Is that right? Well, welcome to into News and Views. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where are you born? Where are you raised?
Sure. I was born in Wilson, raised
Okay.
in Wilson. Actually, correction, I was actually born in Rex Hospital in Raleigh, but I grew up in Wilson.
We'll give you a bio on
that. Technically, I was.
We're going to
born
make
in
you change your website.
Yeah. And I live in New Bern now.
Okay.
But my life's been very interesting. I've had a lot of opportunities that I think have prepared me for this.
Now, you've spent some time up in D.C. I know you've worked for a couple of big names. You worked with Sarah Palin when she was running for the vice presidency.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about your experience in D.C.
Well, so I went to D.C. to work for Senator Helms, and that was an incredible experience. And one of the most important reasons I'm running is because the example of the kind of representative that he was and the kind of representative that I would like to be for Eastern North Carolina.
You don't look that old.
I know.
I'm 38.
Okay.
So this is 1999, right after I was out of college.
Okay.
But Senator Helms was someone who stood on principle, and whether you agreed or disagreed with him, you recognized that he was someone who stood on principle and reflected that, and people respected that. But one of the interesting things about Helms is he was also very effective for North Carolina. And a lot of people say, including my opponents sometimes, that when you stand on principle, you can't be effective. And I would argue that Senator Helms is a great example of how you can. He was probably the most principled person to ever serve in the United States Senate. He's also probably the most effective legislator for North Carolina. And so I think when you really stand by your principles, you can be very, very effective. And so I was honored to have that experience of working with him. And I worked with George W. Bush in the White House and in the Treasury Department, where we were working to track down money headed for terrorists. And started my own business after I worked for Palin in the 2008 race.
What was your business?
It was basically a PR firm, and we helped people with public policy issues and helped them communicate those issues.
Now, would your political adversaries say that it was a lobbyist group?
No, we were not.
Nobody's even tried to accuse you of that.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
We did not take lobbying clients. We only worked with the media and that kind of thing. We didn't work.
So, what motivated you to move back to North Carolina and run for this congressional seat?
Well, this is my home. It's the part of the world that I care about the most, and I've had the great fortune to go all over the world and to see a lot of it. And you realize how important home is for you, having those experiences. And I felt like that Eastern North Carolina was not being as represented as well as it should be.
Would you have moved back to North Carolina if you felt like that North Carolina was being represented well?
I have always wanted to move back to North Carolina. I never intended to be in Washington as long as I was. I went to Washington with the idea that I would get this great opportunity to work in the U.S. Senate for a few years for Senator Helms, and then maybe I'd go to graduate school and move back to North Carolina and do something else with my life. But then I got the opportunity to work for George W. Bush in the White House, and that was an incredible experience. And I had the opportunity to work for Senator Palin. I actually spent a lot of time in Alaska, which was a great experience. And then I had the opportunity to start a business. So there are all these opportunities that came before me that kept me away from home. But I spent a lot of time here. My family's here. My fishing boat is here, which is very important in my life, and so I would have moved back home eventually, regardless.
Now, are you still an eligible bachelor or
That's
married
what I was
kid?
gonna ask.
Yes, I am.
Not that I was interested, but
Well, no, I have, and that's one of the reasons that I think this is a good time in my life to do this, is because I certainly hope to have a family and children. But right now, I don't have to put a family through the pain and difficulty of a campaign, and hopefully, serving in Congress, which is difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people who I know that have served, that have children, it's a big strain on your family to be away so much, and so that's why I feel very comfortable saying that I would serve no more than 4 terms in the Congress, because I would hope that I would have a family that I would want to focus on here in North Carolina.
Pull that microphone just right up in front of you, if you would. Yeah, we're
Yeah,
getting a little bit of echo. There you go. You're right. I ran for the state senate, and just running is a huge time commitment. Let me ask you just a political question.
Sure.
You have been pretty aggressive on Walter. You've been aggressively campaigning, and you would say holding his feet to the fire. Some would say you've just been very, very aggressive. Politically speaking, Walter is well liked. I mean, even if you disagree with his politics, he's very well liked, even by the folks in his party. Have you gotten any kind of negative feedback at all on stylistically coming at him with both barrels?
Well, first of all, I like Walter Jones. Mm-hmm. I think Walter Jones is a good man. My disagreements with Walter Jones are on policy and on his voting in Congress. And every single political ad that we run in this campaign does 2 things. One, it always says Walter Jones is still a good man. He's just not a good conservative. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I supported Walter Jones at one time myself, as a lot of people did here in Eastern North Carolina. But the question is he representing Eastern North Carolina well, and is he representing Eastern North Carolina's values well? And I think when I first supported him, I think the answer was yes, he was. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think for a long time he was. But something changed. Something changed around after 2000 and after his vote on the war, and he started siding with Democrats a lot more. He started voting against the values that I believe in and that I think a lot of people in Eastern North Carolina believe. And now the ad that you'll hear later in this program that's debuting tonight talks about Walter Jones's voting record and how closely it's aligned with Barack Obama. It may surprise people to know that the person that is voting in their name in Washington votes more with Barack Obama's positions than any other member of the House of Representatives in the entire United States. Mm-hmm. More than the representatives from New York, more than the representatives from San Francisco, more than anybody in the United States. Now, that doesn't make sense to me for Eastern North Carolina, or at least for my values. So I think people need an alternative, and people need to know, because Walter Jones doesn't come on the Tom and Sadie show and say, hey, I'm voting for this great thing that Barack Obama has proposed.
Well, he's pretty transparent in terms of what he votes for. I mean, he does come on and say, I'm voting. He's been very clear that he has sided with some pretty liberal Democrats. I think he's the only Republican that voted for public funding for elections.
That's correct.
And I'll say this: he's been pretty transparent about that. I mean, he comes on our program and talks about how that needs to be done. So, not that I necessarily agree with him, but I will give Walter the benefit of the doubt that he's pretty transparent on that. Let's talk about some issues. There's a lot of them to pick from, but let's just sort of go through a bunch of them. I'm sure, Sadie, you've got a couple as well, but start out with the minimum wage. That's been in the news a lot. Where would you stand on that?
The minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage is not the way to create jobs. In fact, it'll cost jobs. Now, we need to make sure people's living standards are good. I believe that the way we do that is through the free market, through encouraging free enterprise, through encouraging the growth of businesses, especially the small businesses that employ that create 2/3 of the new jobs in this country. I think when the government starts to interfere with the private marketplace, bad things happen. So if you just increase the minimum wage and there is no economic rationale other than the government says so, 2 + 2 always equals 4. Mm-hmm. Businesses have a bottom line that they have to make. And I know that as a business owner. If you don't make the money, it doesn't matter what people say is the politically right thing to do. You're not going to be able to pay your employees on Friday. Right. And so the tough decision a lot of companies will have to make is, if you increase the minimum wage, if they have people working in that wage bracket, is whether or not to create a new job. And I would say that it's better to create a job that's a little below the minimum wage, and hopefully to get our economy going so that there is demand for labor that increases the amount of money people can be paid, rather than mandating it from the government, because all that's going to do is cost jobs, millions of jobs.
What would you do with the IRS?
The IRS, in the ideal world, you'd abolish the IRS. We do have an income tax, I suppose. Someone has to administer it. But the big issue, I think, with the IRS right now is the way they have targeted conservative groups unfairly. And there is, whether it's intentional or not from the White House, and some people would argue that maybe it is, they try to please their masters. I mean, as at the Treasury Department, one of my responsibilities in my second stint in Treasury after the campaign as director of the Office of Media Affairs was to oversee the media office at the IRS. So I got a lot of experience with how the IRS works and how it thinks. And ultimately, these are people who are career bureaucrats who are trying to please their masters. And when their masters are adamantly opposed to a particular group and they go after them, you have to think about who gets the blame for that, and whether there was a direct order to go after Tea Party groups or not. It happened. Someone needs to be held accountable, and I would definitely hold the IRS accountable for that. And look, the entire time that I was at the Treasury Department, at least, the Democrat side was setting up all of these tax-exempt groups and all these groups outside the political campaign finance system. John Kerry's entire grassroots operation was carried out by America coming together. And somehow the IRS didn't find it in their heart to go and investigate all of these groups. But when Barack Obama gets in office, all of a sudden the IRS is all over every group that opposes him and not all over all the groups that support him.
You know, part of the frustration, though, is at the end of the day, will anybody be held personally responsible? I mean, are we just going to let them off? Is Lois Lerner going to say, okay, well, you lied to us, and but you lost your job? They get their pension, they retire. I mean, when are we going to start holding people personally responsible, and how can we do that? I mean, so many of them hide behind the fact that we work for the federal government, you can't sue the federal government, when in fact that they are breaking the law. Of course, you don't know what the law is when Obama's in there because it changes every other day, but how do you hold those people accountable?
Well, it's difficult. I think Congress is the first place you hold them accountable. But Congress makes the laws.
Right.
And Congress can decide what is and isn't illegal and how people in the federal government can conduct themselves. Now, Barack Obama will probably try to override that with an executive order, but ultimately Congress has the legal power and authority to counteract that. I think Congress has got to focus a lot more on oversight. I think the Government Oversight Committee is one of the most important committees in the entire House of Representatives because that is where the people get to voice their concerns with the federal government and how it administers the laws. And we need to focus a lot more on oversight. I'd be very supportive of measures that would prevent these sorts of things from happening in the future. If a conservative group is breaking our laws in the country, they should pay the consequence, but so should a liberal group. It shouldn't just be conservative groups. And honestly, a lot of the conservative groups are being unfairly targeted. And I hear this from Tea Party groups all over Eastern North Carolina. They are afraid to let their voices be known, even the ones that are not tax-exempt organizations, because they're afraid just because they're called Tea Party that eventually somebody in the Obama administration is going to decide to come after them, and there won't be anybody to defend them. One of the reasons I'm running is because I'm going to defend them.
Our special guest this afternoon is Taylor Griffin. He is running against Walter Jones for the Republican primary for the North Carolina 3rd Congressional District.
Taylor, we have a big military listening audience, and we're in the area where a lot of military live. Walter is very well known with military. He goes to Walter Reed Hospital all the time. He visits with our disabled vets. And I guess my question is, he talks a lot when he comes in and talks with us about his view on Afghanistan and our foreign policy. Where do you stand, not just with Afghanistan, but what's going on right now with the Russia-Ukraine crisis? What would you be talking about?
That's an excellent question. So first of all, I want to start with the military is extremely important to Eastern North Carolina. There are 39,000 active duty service personnel in Eastern North Carolina. Some of our campaign staff are military spouses. And so we get, at least within our campaign family, we get a lot of, we experience a lot of the issues that the military is dealing with. My grandfather was a colonel in the Army, so my mom grew up an Army brat. And the thing that we have to be careful about in political office is I don't think that politicians think carefully about what what they're asking the military to do. And when they ask the military to do things, they will do it. But we have to make sure we give them the support. I would say we're mostly Marines in Eastern North Carolina. It's a military community. And a lot of my friends are Marines, and one friend of mine who's a Marine told me, a Marine, if you ask a Marine to take over the world with a rubber band and a paperclip, they will try to do that and might just succeed. But from the political level, we have to give them the support that they deserve to accomplish the missions that we ask them to accomplish. I think in Afghanistan right now, the terms of engagement that we've got our Marines living under, the level of support that we are giving them is not adequate to justify what we're asking them to do. So if we're not going to give them the support that they deserve to do the mission, we need to bring them home. And we are going to bring the Marines home and the Army personnel home and the Air Force personnel and the rest of the service personnel. We're going to bring them home at the end of 2014. And so I think that's an issue that I've never criticized Congressman Jones for.
In hindsight, in 2020, hindsight's 2020, but in hindsight, well, I don't know in this case if it is 2020. In hindsight, should we have gone into Iraq and Afghanistan?
It's not quite 2020 because I think that history will eventually tell us whether or not these were good or bad decisions. I think that it has been incredibly difficult, far more difficult than we would have originally assumed it would be. And I think that Congressman Jones has had a change of heart about that, and I think that's fair. He represents people who are having to go and fight for our country. But I think that when we do ask them to fight, we have to stand behind them. And so although I understand Congressman Jones's position on it, I'm concerned about whether or not he has stood behind them strongly enough. And I'll give you one example. Recently, he's gotten a lot of criticism for us on votes that were not fiscally conservative. So and I don't know exactly why he did this, but recently we had a vote in the House of Representatives to restore the benefits that to our veterans that were cut under the sequester. Walter Jones was one of the only people who voted against that in the entire Congress, Democrat or Republican. He was one of the few. In North Carolina, he was the only member of the North Carolina delegation, Democrat or Republican, that voted against that.
I will ask him. He's going to be on with us next week. I'll ask him why. I'm sure he's got an interesting reason because everything he does is pro-military, pro-veteran.
Yeah.
So,
and usually it hasn't gone far enough, and
yeah,
that's why
he
he's
votes
voting
against it because he wanted more.
And let's give him that. Let's say it didn't go far enough because maybe that is it. Because for people who haven't enlisted yet, we don't increase the cost of living increase. We leave that at 1% until you get to retirement age. But I would argue that if he was successful, there would be no restoration of benefits to anyone. So voting against that was a vote that did not help our veterans. And so in my view, if I am a fiscal conservative, we made a solemn promise to our veterans that we would support them and that we would give them a retirement with a cost of living increase of 2%, not 1%. And after they've served, to go back and change that is completely unfair. We need to, we do need to cut back the government, but we need to cut it back somewhere else. That shouldn't be the first place we cut.
You're a fiscal conservative. Where are you on social issues?
On social issues, well, I believe life begins at conception. I think Congressman Jones and I agree pretty much across the board on most conservative issues. This is why we haven't talked a lot about it on the campaign, because I think we agree it isn't a big difference between us.
Where do you stand on gay marriage?
On gay marriage, marriage is between a man and a woman. I mean, we have to be. I'm a Christian. I believe that that's how we define marriage, and I stand strongly behind that. North Carolina, as the voters of North Carolina spoke at the polls.
Okay, by the way, get ready to be called a bigot, because every time, we
always are. Join the club.
Yeah. Which is really unfortunate that you can't, go back to biblical standards and without being called names. But
right.
We're about out of time. Website for our folks if they want more information?
TaylorGriffin.org. And please go on our website, find out more about our campaign, send us a note. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody, one person, 10 people, 50 people.
How many miles you put on the car?
22,000,
wow.
I think, so far. It's enough to go to China and back, and then back again.
And you,
not that I would want to go to China.
And you got another 2 months to go?
Yeah.
A month and a half to go?
Month and a half to go.
All right. Well, much success to you, and,
Thank you.
and to your opponent. I'll say it to Walter too. But I appreciate anybody that gets in the fray and rolls up the shirt sleeves. I've done it. It's a lot of work. You're making yourself very, very vulnerable, and we need good men to run. One of the interesting things is looking at the eastern North Carolina landscape today compared to just 20 years ago. I mean, we have your race with Walter Jones. We have the race between David Rouser and Woody White down in the 7th Congressional District. 20 years ago, we couldn't get a Republican to run. Now, in both of these districts, a Republican will probably, I would be shocked if Republicans didn't win in both of those districts. And we have good, healthy primary campaigns in both those districts for Republicans, unheard of 20 years ago.
And look, this is great for democracy, right? Because you're right, in the 3rd Congressional District, whoever wins on May 6th in the primary is
there a Democrat running?
Yeah, there is a Democrat that's filed. But there's, absent something crazy happening, is going to be the congressman.
Right.
Mitt Romney won the 3rd Congressional District by 20%. So that happens all over the country. There are districts that are solely Democratic and districts that are solely Republican. The problem with that is that members of Congress no longer have to be answerable to their constituents by facing tough elections. So one of my arguments in this campaign is we have to look at primary elections as general elections. And I think you're seeing that in Eastern North Carolina, and Eastern North Carolina is leading the way.
Yep. Taylor Griffin, who is running against Walter Jones in May 6th primary for North Carolina's 3rd Congressional District. Thanks for stopping by, Taylor. Well, you're headed off to speak somewhere tonight, aren't you?
Yes, we'll be speaking with the Eastern North Carolina Tea Party this evening.
All right. If you want to come out and hear Taylor, I think that's over in McAllister's Deli in
exactly right.
Greenville. So if you want to
right.
hear more from Taylor, head on out there and get a sub or a sandwich and say hello to Taylor Griffin. Well, thanks for being with us. Eastern Carolina News
thanks,
and
Taylor.
Views. When we come back, we're going to play a little political trivia. Let's open up the phone lines, 561-8255, 561-TALK. Stay with us. Much more to come.